soon as Carrie, who was the one with all the answers, although we could probably start on the syndication side a little bit too.
I know a
Maybe
little
we
bit
could do
about that.
that because I want to be cognizant of everyone's time. Although we're just hanging, so you guys, first of all, you guys can drop in and out whenever you want. If you've got a couple questions and then you got to bolt, totally get it. If you, in the future, if you want to join, halfway through, as long as we're still on, it's meant to be drinking some coffee, just chilling. I might not even shower next time.
I probably still will.
Why don't we, while we wait for Carrie, why don't we, I had a couple questions here on the syndication side. So I just wanted to just do something real quick here. All right, I think I'm recording already. So we're gonna wait for Carrie to, I know most people, look, I know most of you probably have real estate questions, which is why it's called Coffee with Carrie. But there are obviously, syndication questions that I think you guys, or if somebody's listening, is interested in. So again, this Coffee with Carrie is meant to be super cash. We're going to do this, I think, twice a week, probably Saturdays and Wednesdays, for about an hour or half an hour. If nobody shows up, we'll record it. And if you've got specific questions, great. If you've got a specific question, just put something in the chat real quick and then I'll turn to you. But one of the things actually, which was a little surprising to me is, Bethany, we've been talking to all of our clients, and one of the questions that came up on the syndication side, which I thought was interesting because, obviously being the attorney, everything is kind of obvious to me, but then I have to say, I realize that that's not the issue there. I'm going to just reach you there, but, and that is, do you have an obligation to return investors' money if you're in a syndication? And the answer is no, 100% no. In fact, that's why we draft all these documents, the PPM and all those disclosure documents, because this is one of those scenarios that everybody needs to be aware of, which is we may have some event that causes a recession or just naturally or like this that we just don't know. And so you have to go in it understanding that. And if you read, I don't know how many of you actually read PPMs since they're a cure for insomnia, but there's actually specific language that says, hey, there's no assurances that, number one, you're going to get a distribution. There's no assurances that, rents are going to go up. In fact, rents may go down, which is what's probably going to happen. And we may have something like, the Great Recession of '08. So things can go wrong. So if you're already in a deal and investors are already part of your company, then you don't have an obligation, a legal obligation anyway, to return people's money. And I will also caution people that even if you want to return monies just because of either the goodness of your heart or, look, it's quite possible that one of your investors really has an economic issue. Maybe, they're dealing with the coronavirus, or maybe a family member and it's an emergency and they need their money back. You really want to reach out to your securities attorney before you start making one-on-one agreements, because the documents don't allow for that. You can't just unilaterally pick and choose and say, hey, Melanie's in trouble, I'm going to return Melanie's, we're either I as a sponsor is going to return Melanie's money, or I'm going to respond, Michael's money. You can't just pick and choose. So you just got to be really careful about that. But from a legal obligation, you certainly don't have that. Where it gets a little trickier, obviously, if you're raising money and you haven't accepted monies, then obviously that's probably a moot point. And then the middle piece is where it gets a little bit tricky, and there's no one answer fits all. And that is, well, what if you've already started a raise and you've started accepting monies from investors? Then what is your obligation? At what point do you have to basically call the whole thing off and return everyone's money? Because there is, at least in our documentation, there is a clause in there that says, hey, if we don't close, we're going to return all of your investor monies. And so that's where it gets tricky. At some point, you're going to have to make a decision like, hey, this is not going to go forward. I can't just keep investors' money sitting in a bank account while I try and close. So that's another conversation you want to have with your securities attorney. But anyway, that's kind of my thoughts. I'll look at this, raising hands and everything. We're A students. Go ahead, Melanie. Go ask your question.
So I was on a webinar with Nighthawk yesterday or the day before, and I had asked this specific question. What if you're raising, and it's not you that can't close, the team wants to close, but someone before closing, they've signed the PPM, they've wired the money, but we haven't closed yet, and they want their money back. Are they, because they've signed the PPM, does that fall under what you talked about first?
Yes, so that's a great question. So if somebody's already, think of it as a company. I mean, at the end of the day, your LLC, it's a company, and everybody becomes an owner and a member of this company. So the minute that they officially become members of the company, and that's different for everyone. So in our world, that happens when three things happen really. Number one, they sign the operating agreement. That's kind of the official, well, operating and subscription agreement. They've wired the money. And you countersign the documents. So once all those are fully executed, they're members of that company, and from a legal standpoint, they wouldn't be able to get out. Now, again, if you don't close, you have an obligation to return all of their monies, obviously. And the tricky part then is just at what point do you make that decision? And it's really a business decision of, hey, we're not going to be able to close. I mean, we've got a client, for example, who, what if you get an extension? Like, what if you say, look, it's going to take another 6 months to close or 3 months to close? What's going on there? And so anyway, so that's where it gets a little bit tricky. And I think we just need to just talk to your securities counsel, because it's all going to be facts and circumstances. So, hey, Carrie.
Good morning.
How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
They got that artwork in the back.
Yeah, I had to move. There was too much light coming in before. I was like this silhouetted shadow. It looked a little creepy.
Cool. Well, Coffee with Carrie, welcome to the inaugural episode of Coffee with Carrie.
And Mauricio and Bethany.
And yeah, so we kind of told everyone at the beginning that this was really informal. We're gonna do these a couple times a week, and you'll be lucky if I shower next time. I'll just probably be in my robe or something. So it's meant to be casual. It's meant to really answer your questions, because, Carrie and Bethany and I were talking a couple days ago, and like the situation is so fluid that, information that you heard 2 weeks ago from some webinar, probably isn't good anymore. In fact, my good friend, Billy Brown, who's a lender, a broker, he did a presentation yesterday at the Secrets of Successful Syndication with the real estate guys. And he recorded it like the day before. And he even admitted, like, hey, like the recording didn't come out great. There was some issues with it. He's like, hey, it doesn't matter. It's all irrelevant anyway, because things have changed since yesterday. So we want to be able to give you guys information that's current. And so we just figured if we do these twice a week or something, we'll have the more current information. So I'm going to start off with having Carrie talk about maybe one or two subjects, but then I really want to open it up to questions, because the whole idea here is to answer your specific questions. But I think the two questions I've seen most people ask, and we'll just take them in order, is number one, tenants. What do you do with tenants who call you, either tenants who call you and say, look, I'm not going to be able to make rent this month because I got laid off or whatever, or maybe more realistically, next week, the checks just don't come in. So what do you do with those? And then on the flip side, what do you do with your lender? And specifically, the hot topic these days is forbearance. So I definitely want to talk a little bit about forbearance, and I'm sure people will have questions. So Carrie, why don't we start with the first one, which is you're an apartment owner, you own a C-class apartment, and tenants are starting to call you and say, hey, I need to skip rent this month. What are your options and what are your legal rights in those scenarios?
Okay, so of course, because I'm a lawyer, I'm going to say the first thing is your particular lease with your tenant largely controls. So the first thing that you'll need to do is pull out your lease, your form of lease that you have with the tenants. You have counsel send it to them, because we'll want to look at whether you have a forbearance clause and what type of forbearance clause. The irony in all of this is that jurisdictions that typically have perennial natural disasters, like for example, a lot of my clients that have assets in the hurricane belt, they have pretty well fleshed out force majeure clauses. Unfortunately for everyone, those force majeure clauses are clearly in contemplation of natural disasters like hurricanes and tornadoes, and they don't contain the sort of vague boilerplate language that, for example, we slap on a lot of leases in Illinois, which is like, in the event there's something, but what, I mean, I have no recollection of a tornado tearing through Chicago, Illinois, right? But ironically, that sort of vague, like, yeah, whatever, I guess if something strange happened, like the zombie apocalypse, you don't have to pay rent. Well, yeah, we're in that. And the irony is the force majeure clauses that really talk about loss of power and having to not have access for 14 days. And then if it continues for 30 days, the tenant can terminate. Well, those are actually sort of less helpful in this situation because they're very specific. They don't contain vague language, and we're in a situation that was never contemplated by anybody. So point being, we'll start with the force majeure clause. After you look at that, and to the extent that it doesn't really speak to this situation, the other thing you have to look at is what are the laws and emergency measures that your jurisdiction has passed, because that'll supersede your lease. But again, my third rule, it's always negotiable. So then it's your opportunity, then it's a conversation with the tenant. And my best recommendation, what I'm seeing a lot of is, like if you're in a jurisdiction where the state or the city or whatever county said everybody gets a rent holiday. Well, that's a break. That doesn't mean the tenants don't have to pay the rent. It just means that they don't have to pay it for these like 30 to 90 days, depending on the jurisdiction. And then they have to catch it up. You as the landlord can require them to show evidence of having been impacted by Corona, because it isn't like you're doing fine, you're day trading, from your house making bank, and now you don't have to pay your rent. It is, you've had a job loss. You have to be able to demonstrate that you have a loss. And then it's a deferral. But I think we all have to be looking 3 steps ahead here, which is that the same tenants that are getting laid off or that are having demonstrable hardship as a result of Corona are most likely not going to then be life back to normal in 60 to 90 days. And so for you as a landlord, what's going to happen when this holiday breaks and things are quote unquote back to normal is that you're going to get your rights back to go evict tenants. But if I'm in your shoes, what I want to say is, well, okay, so now I'm in a new rental market. It's soft. I'd have to turn the apartment. I have to go through eviction proceedings. And again, if you're, in a city, right, like San Francisco, you'll spend a year trying to get a non-paying tenant out of a place, even if it's like the carriage house in your backyard, right? And that's in a booming economy. So you have to recognize that a lot of the landlord-tenant eviction proceedings are very skewed in favor of tenants because it's their home. So my recommendation is get out in front of it. I've seen some great letters from landlords proactively reaching out to tenants on a weekly basis in jurisdictions where we have the tolling of eviction statutes and rent holidays for tenants, saying, we expect you to pay rent April 1. If you are having a hardship, reach out to us. If we don't hear from you, we will assume you are not having a hardship and we'll be looking for your rent. And then, and it's all wrapped in fluffy, touchy-feely language about being here from you and we're all here in it together. But so it's not a threatening letter. It's a friendly letter, but it's reach out to us. You have to communicate with us, put the burden on the tenant, and be clear that they have to be able to demonstrate they've had hardships, and then restructure with them. And that restructure should involve, if it were me, I'd want a gradual escalation to catch up, because they're not going to be able to pay double rent in July or August, right? So gradually scale it up so that their obligation to make you whole increases as the economy recovers and they have time to go out and find a new job or reposition or whatever. You can contemplate, if you want, extend their lease. If you give them a rent holiday for 2 months or 3 months, you can extend their lease 3 months on the back end, which gives you more time to make up the rent, keeps them on the hook longer. And the other thing is that I want a waiver of rights that they might have under this legislation.
Can you speak a little bit more about that? So when you say waiver of their rights, what rights are we talking about specifically, and what do you mean by waiver of rights?
Sorry, the waiver of rights meaning that whatever legislation they have rights under right now via their city or local government that created, most municipalities that are in the midst of Corona quarantining and lockdowns have also passed legislation in favor of tenants. If you're not on lockdown, you probably will be at some point. And with lockdown, what we're seeing comes this legislation. So I think you need to assume you're going to fall under it at some point in time. And so what you want when you enter into a rent I would do it as a side letter agreement, but a rent restructuring agreement, right? I would want to include a paragraph that says that, as consideration for entering into this agreement and giving the tenant, because you're going to give them more than what's under the statute, right? That's your legal hook. So the statute's going to say, well, they can defer paying the rent for 2 months. But what you're going to say is, pursuant to the legislation, I'm going to let you defer paying rent for 2 months, and I'm going to give you 6 months, or because most of the legislation is like they can, as long as we're in this crisis, whatever, it's a 60-day to be extended hiatus, and then you get 6 months to pay it back. Well, what I'm saying is, they're not going to be able to pay it back right away. 6 months might not be enough time for them. I'd extend the lease 2 more months. So that gives you 2 more months that you don't have to find a new tenant in a soft economy. And give them 8 months to make, escalating, right? So that it's a gradual repayment. Because you're giving them more benefits under the statute, that's what we call legally consideration. That makes a contract enforceable. And so then that's where you can say, in consideration for giving you this extra accommodation, you're going to waive any rights you might have under the current or future legislation around coronavirus. Meaning that they can't take your rent holiday and then come back and say, well, no, I'm just not going to pay you. If states, if there's any, we don't know where this is going to go. So to the extent that states grant further relief, they're waiving that essentially.
Got it. Okay, cool.
It's just a little extra protection for you.
No, that's great. That's great. And is there any chance do you have any of those sample letters? That's something we can.
I could scrub them, but
yeah, let's do that. Let's get that, and that'll be something I think that'd be valuable to everyone listening. Before we go on to the lender part, does anybody that's on the call have anything specific about how to deal with the tenant? Darina, what if the tenants refuse to extend their lease?
Okay, so that's fine. Then what you do is you give them the minimum amount of time you have to for the rent deferral. You structure it as a deferral. And then what you do as a little leverage is you divide up the number of days left in their lease by the two or three extra months that you're giving them for the deferral. And you divide it and you tell them, okay, so your new monthly rent is your monthly rent plus X percentage of what you aren't paying in these 60 to 90 days, right? And to a lot of tenants, that's going to get their attention because that's going to be a difficult number, right? And the point is, if they refuse and they're like, fine, I'll pay it. Remember, once this tolling is up, you still have all the rights and remedies available to you as a landlord to evict them, to get attorney's fees for non-payment of rent, all of your court costs. It's a pain, but you can get that, and you can evict them, and so you can go after them.
Let's talk about that, because I did see that somebody was asking that too. Is if they just don't want to end up not paying. A lot of jurisdictions have these eviction restrictions that who knows how long they're going to go on. But let's say it goes on for 6 months and then they leave right before you evict them, or you have to go, in California, as we know, it's really hard to get people out. It takes a while. Does it still go, do you think it's going to still go on their record as an eviction? Do you still, your right at that point is to go after them in small claims or whatever and get the back paid rent plus attorney fees plus all your usual remedies, right?
Right. But the issue is, again, there is no legislation out there exempting tenants from paying rent. It's merely requiring landlords to give them a deferral, and it's tolling eviction statutes. And that is not just altruism. They have to, the reason the courts have told eviction statutes is because they have a constitutional obligation to give people due process, which requires judges to be in chambers, in courtrooms, in closed spaces with all kinds of people. Namely, I don't know if anybody's ever been to eviction court, but if you ever saw the 80s sitcom Night Court, it's a lot like that. It's not safe right now. It's not like, this isn't Law and Order. You don't have one tenant, one plaintiff or one defendant and the prosecutor. No, you've got it's Monday night at 6 p.m. Everybody in, that jurisdiction and that court's district that's getting evicted is there. And so it's just not safe to put people, it's too much exposure. You can't do social distancing. So recognize that that's another driver in this. I mean, the government isn't, right now we're dressing everything up as like altruism, but that's a big part of this. So when the quarantines are lifted and we've hit the peak or whatever it is going to be the trigger that things get back to normal, then the eviction process starts. It's dictated by statute. If tenants aren't paying their rent, you can evict them. And if they just abandon, you still get a judgment against them. And that judgment prevents them. I mean, it is very hard, as you know, when your property management companies, when you run a background check on a tenant, a judgment against a tenant for failure to pay their rent and being evicted, you're not gonna rent to them.
Right. No, I think that's I think ultimately that's, in my mind, that's the big hook, because I've been trying to think of like, what's the incentive? If you can't get evicted for 12 months, and even if I haven't lost my job, maybe I'm not very sure, I'm a worker and I'm hoarding cash, other people aren't paying rent, they can't evict me for 12 months. I'm like, why would I pay rent for 12 months? And then maybe at that point I negotiate cash for keys, because it's going to take you another 6 months to evict me, even, all that stuff. But I think that's the hook, is that good luck getting a rental, your next rental, because you're certainly not going to get a recommendation from your landlord. And the leverage is, hey, if you don't pay, or most likely come up with a payment plan, then I'm going to go to court, and that's going to be a mark on your record, and forget it. You're never going to be able to rent to anybody. So I think that's the leverage.
Well, you're right. You're not going to be able to, it's going to be difficult to get a lease. It's going to be difficult to get a mortgage. It's going to be difficult to get a consumer credit card. Yes, these are unprecedented times, but remember, I mean, the linchpin of 2008 was that Moody's automatically, with almost no investigation, gave all bundles of mortgages an A+ rating, because the assumption was the last thing people are going to default on is the roof over their head. Now, that was faulty logic on their part, but the point is that even with FICO and, in the credit rating system, a judgment against you for an eviction, even right now, that is going to be something difficult to overcome, because you have all these tools available to you, right? Everybody's going to know that there were rent holidays, right? This was like, you just walked away. That is a very difficult thing to explain.
Yep, and as we all know, when we're applying for rent, you typically have to put down who your prior landlords are, so they're going to call, and the landlord's not going to be in any mood to be giving out
well, and if you
reviews.
And you're always entitled as a landlord, with their permission, of course, but like part of the application process is a credit check. Well, that's going to show up on a credit check. You can't hide that. So even if even if you didn't ask for a reference, as a landlord, you're always, no matter, even all of the civil rights legislation, there's no protection that, a landlord is always protected from running a credit check before they rent to a tenant. And that's always going to show up. And so there is that. But I also find, what I find in my experience is very persuasive, is the people that think that they just shouldn't have to extend the lease and you should just give them a break because they have no concept about the fact that you have financial obligations too. When you break it down and show them the numbers, suddenly, then for a lot of tenants, that 2-month extension looks less like you're forcing me to extend a lease I can't afford. And it looks a little bit more like it's actually an accommodation to you.
So I think I got that, which is great. Are you suggesting, which I think is great, maybe even in that letter, or maybe it's a separate letter that you're sending to tenants, like if they're not paying you because they're just assuming, look, you're the rich landlord, and maybe you're even getting a forbearance somewhere, that if you show them the numbers, they look, it's not just rent. I got to keep the maintenance going. I got to keep the electricity on, all these things. I have expenses too. And if you don't pay rent and everybody else doesn't pay rent, this whole thing falls apart. And that way you bring in a little bit of the conscience into it too. It's not like the landlord's making out like a bank. So cool. I wanted to move on, unless there's another question on the tenant thing. I was going to move on to the forbearance and the lender discussions, but I want to defer first to you guys if there's anything specific, since you guys took the time to be on the call live. Anybody can't see all of you. So if you've got something, just say something on the chat, and then I'll either unmute you or we'll move over to the lender stuff. All right, so on the lender side, the big word that I'm starting to hear a lot about, I spend a lot of time on social media, so I'm just reading everybody's comments so I kind of get a pulse of what the concerns are, but forbearance. Why don't we first talk about what forbearance is, first of all, just in general, to make sure everybody's on the same page, and what you should be doing as a landlord regarding your lender, not only just communicating with the lender, but also specifically on the forbearance, since this is starting to pop up a bit.
So a forbearance is a legal agreement that essentially restructures the term of a loan between the lender and the borrower. And it's where, the lender forbears some of its benefits of the agreement that was previously made. And it gets, it's a binding loan agreement. Historically, it's typically, it's a document, it's an agreement that's used in restructuring a troubled loan. A forbearance agreement, it can show up in credit. It is typically, historically, it's not as negative as a default, but it is one of the steps in a distressed loan. So historically, borrowers have been, don't really want to enter into forbearance agreements because it's seen as sort of a negative aspect of your credit history. So what the agencies are doing right now as part of the stimulus relief is they are offering, borrowers roughly 90 days. They're offering borrowers the option to enter into a forbearance agreement, giving them a 90-day period where they can stop, where they don't have to make their mortgage payments, but then they would have to, make it up, defer the payments over time. And the reality is, lenders need you to enter into this agreement because they have to memorialize their terms, and they still have to have a document evidencing that they didn't just waive it, they didn't forgive it. They're merely giving you more time to pay it. So there's been a lot of questions because people are afraid, well, yeah, do I take this? And if I take it, is this going to prevent me from getting a loan in the future? Is this going to forever put me in the category of unfinanceable or a low quality borrower? And I reached out to my friends and colleagues who represent lenders, both on the agency lenders, but also I reached out to my colleagues who represent a variety of regional and national banks. And I also talked to a former client of mine who, for a long time before he retired, was the president of a large multifamily REIT, privately traded REIT that just invested in Class A apartment buildings around the country. And I said, tell me about this. What do you think the perspective is going to be to borrowers going on down the line who've taken advantage of this forbearance? What is this going to do? So I asked my colleagues who represent the agency lenders like Fannie, Freddie, and HUD said, so what's the deal? A lot of people are suspicious of it. And they were like, no, this isn't going to be seen as a problem going forward. We don't think that this will be negative because these are unprecedented times. The agencies, they're under pressure from the government to keep lending, but nobody knows what's going on. And there's, when you go for another agency loan, they're going to be able to see all the details of it. So as long as you reach out and you stay in contact with your lender and you adhere to the terms of the forbearance agreement, it should be fine. Now, if you don't adhere to the terms, then it's going to be like any other agency loan that you default on. That's going to be a bad situation.
Carrie, is that like is this kind of like a simple, they're just going to send you over a one-page addendum and you just kind of sign and you're on? Or is that something that, they should be reaching out to their real estate attorney and making sure that's negotiated properly? Because it's going to be a long, complex loan, kind of a loan agreement, but it's sort of the addendum.
Yeah. Okay. So everybody raise their hand if you've done an agency loan, like a HUD loan in the past, maybe their 223 program, the simple streamlined one. Yeah. Did it look simple and streamlined to anybody? No, no, it's not a one pager. HUD, I don't think the agencies know how to do one page. It is, you know, it's your typical like crazy legal language, convoluted, difficult to make sense of. I mean, it's not the phone book that is, you know, your typical agency loan, but it's a lot of paper. You will want counsel to review it and explain it because it's important that you understand what the terms are and that you adhere to it, because the big thing is, you know, it's not going to be a problem getting future agency loans as long as you meet your obligations under the forbearance agreement. And in order to meet them, you need to understand what they are. And, you know, it's broadly, I mean, it's, you know what these loan language, I mean, these documents, it's like, if we feel insecure for any reason or no reason, we can call the loan. That's literally a provision in all of these documents buried in there. Insecure, I mean, you know, if you don't feel insecure right now, I would argue that you're not legally competent to do business. I mean, so, you know, they're not negotiating. What the guys that I talked to did say is they're not doing a lot of, like, they don't have a mandate to heavily negotiate these, because unlike forbearance agreements that agencies enter into during strong economic times, this is sort of a blanket kind of one size fits all program, where they're trying to make it that way. But there's little things that there are some accommodations that they'll agree to, like, you know, if you have counsel, we can flesh out that insecurity clause a little bit. We can get maybe longer grace periods. You know, we can work a little bit on specific, under certain circumstances, you know, the actual economics of your forbearance agreement in terms of debt service coverage ratios and stuff like that.
Carrie, what about if you don't have an agency loan? If you've got, you know, I think one of our clients had a CBRE loan, or if it's just, you know, we've got clients who have private loans. Like, what are your thoughts on that being on your credit? Because obviously they're not agency guys.
Right.
What are your thoughts on that?
Okay. So I called actually a former colleague and pretty close friend of Bethany's and mine, who has been representing the real estate lenders for about 20 years. We came up together, and she said she didn't think it was going to be a problem at all. And the clients that she represents did not, you know, what she likened it to was in 08 and 09, basically between 08 and 2011, we restructured a lot of deals for a lot of clients, right? There were a lot of deeds in lieu. There were clients had to give back properties. Some clients even went into foreclosure, although we worked hard to avoid that. It was a mess. And until then, you know, we felt like we were walking into conference rooms to meet with clients. Like, we felt like we were giving them, you know, the news that they were like terminally ill, because when at that point in 08 and 09, when you said to someone, okay, basically I think the best we can do is a deed in lieu and you can avoid foreclosure, but you're gonna have to give the property back. Before 08, that was the death knell to your borrowing experience in the real estate world. And to have to walk in and say that to somebody who'd been a builder, developer, syndicator for all these years, that it was like you were basically, at the time, you were telling them, like, you have to find a new livelihood. When this shakes out, you're done. That's how it was perceived. And lo and behold, even BKs are not, like, it's a blip on the radar. Like, if it's between 2008 and 2011, lenders do not care. It doesn't matter, because they recognize that this isn't indicative of an incompetent borrower or poor credit risk. This is indicative of someone who was doing deals during the recession. And so she actually, like, she gave me that exact example, and said, we are like, our thinking and what we're hearing from the lenders is a forbearance agreement at this point in time, you know, in 2020 is not going to be an issue. It's going to be the same thing that a BK or a foreclosure or a deed in lieu was in 2008, 9, or 10. So
Yeah, and it makes sense, right? I mean, it's everybody's kind of graded on a curve. So I mean, if everybody, 5 years from now is going for a loan and 90% of people have that forbearance on them, that's just kind of thing. I got one other question that I have, but I just, again, wanted to take a pause. And if anybody's got a question about anything, what's your most pressing question that you have? I wanted to answer those. So if you want to either raise your hand or just put something in the chat, Darina, I'm going to unmute you. You should ask it directly. You're on.
Hi, yeah, so say it's a smaller loan, maybe not for 100 units, but for 4 or 5 family. I actually made a call to the bank and they said, yes, we can process that forbearance, but you have to pay balloon payment in 3 months. Now, I had some discussions with my colleagues and they said, well, yes, you can come up with the money. I'm pretty sure my tenants, I communicated with all of them, they are paying this month in April. That's what they said. So it was just a precautious. So the bank said, yes, there's a balloon payment. So I wonder for those people who, if they think they can pay, how are they going to come up with, 3 months of payments? That's number one. Number two, if they have to restructure the loan, the interest rates will change. The interest rate will change as far as I understand. And what if that person who is restructuring the loan cannot qualify for loan anymore? I mean, these are all conversations like sort of happening online. So I want to clarify that. Thank you.
Right. So, I mean, yeah, I find that conversation completely annoying with the bank. I mean, sure, we'll give you a forbearance, but you need to make a balloon payment in 3 months. I mean, no, okay, so that's a no. We're not, that's, to me, it's fine. I guess you can't get what you don't ask for. But I think at that point, my response to the bank is that doesn't work. You guys are in the habit of underwriting real estate loans. Let's walk through that, because I don't think it's helpful in this environment to talk about theoretical. The numbers don't lie. So the best thing to do is the bank comes back with balloon payment is walk through the numbers with them and recognize that you can't, a balloon payment in 90 days isn't going to work for anyone, and they will see that. And so what you need to do, I mean, yes, rates can change, and whether or not people qualify for new loans we're in a whole new universe, and they're going to, we'll have to cross that bridge when we get to it. But with respect to the loans you're in right now, the bank isn't re-underwriting the borrower at this point, right? You're in a loan that you're trying to restructure. And so the question of whether or not you're going to qualify, it might be an issue going forward for new loans, but in this loan, this isn't, in a loan you're trying to restructure, that's not necessarily the critical issue. The critical issue with your lender is, and the conversation needs to be framed as, I want to make you whole. I want to perform under my loan. These are unprecedented times. I need a forbearance, or I need to restructure this. And 90 days isn't going to be enough time for me to make the balloon payment, because my tenants aren't going to be able to make up that kind of money. So can we, tenants get 6 months in many states and in many cities, right? So those are the talking points. And this is probably where, at this point, if that's what my lender came back with, I would probably engage counsel and, continue to have the conversation about, we agree. Okay. So what we know is we're all agreed that we need a forbearance. We're all agreed that I need a break for a certain amount of time. And we're agreed that the lender needs to get paid what I'm not paying them now at some point in the future. And then the question is, how long and over what period of time? And that's where, a balloon payment in 3 months, no, not helpful. A balloon payment in 6 months, or as I said, a graduated mortgage payment, right, over the term of the loan. Those are all things that can work. A balloon payment at the end of the loan, right? But they have many tools in their toolbox. To me, that balloon payment in 90 days, I don't want to say it's a non-starter, but I view that as just sort of their opening offer.
Let me make a comment, because that's exactly right. I think sometimes people forget, that's something you've been talking about for the last couple of weeks now. Like, everything's negotiable. We're in, very unique times. But when you call a lender on your own, they're going to give you the initial standard, whatever, but you just got to realize that, you know, Carrie does this all the time, and she's constantly on the phone with lenders pushing back and negotiating. That's what your lawyer is meant to do, is to negotiate with these guys. They're going to want to have the best case scenario for them. You're going to come back with your best scenario, and then you're going to negotiate and meet somewhere, hopefully somewhere in the middle. But your real estate attorney can work wonders when you're in situations like this. Now, I understand if it's a 4-unit or 5-unit, you've got to figure out the cost considerations there. But not only is everything negotiable now, just in general, you know, my observation, especially with Carrie, is, you know, just because the lender wants it a certain way, a lot of times they have the leverage and they're like, well, forget it, then we won't make the loan. But they want to make the loan, and now they want to work with you because, you know, Carrie, you talked about this last week. They're not in the business of taking over and taking back property. That's like the last thing they want to do is have you default and then have to go in there and take over your property. What about the interest rate thing, Carrie? I think she brought that up too. Is it possible during these forbearance that they say, well, yeah, we're going to do this new agreement. Yeah, it's not a new loan, so you don't have to qualify, but we're going to jack up your interest rate by, 3%.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a lot of lenders that are going to try to do that. We're seeing a lot of loans, especially in the private equity or hard money lender space, that are doing that. But here's the deal. Again, no. I mean, the Fed's just cut interest rates to 0. So no. You know, remember, why do we care about the Fed rate? Why do we care about LIBOR for as long as LIBOR continues to exist? Because that's what the bank is paying to get the money to lend it to you. I mean, the reality is, in many ways, banks are to money what flippers are to single-family homes, right? Like, I mean, they make money on the spread. It's arbitrage. Like, they borrow money from the central banks at a set interest rate, and then they loan it to you at a higher interest rate, and they make the delta. So when we say, when the Fed announced that they've cut rates, and everybody on Wall Street and Squawk Box and CNBC is all like, oh, yay, it's so great. Well, that's because that doesn't affect you. You're not borrowing money from the Fed, right? Money just went on sale for the bank. So when the bank then says to you, hey, we're having a crisis, and the Fed's just cut our borrowing rate to 0, so what we're going to do is jack up your rate. What I say is, don't be an asshole. I mean, no, like they're not being injured here, and they aren't in a forbearance situation because you didn't manage the property, or you became a poor credit risk, or because this asset became a higher credit risk. We are in this situation because we're having a global pandemic, which, hello, is not an economic, like that's not the result. Like, you didn't do that. And the economy hasn't changed because the system is broken. That's where this isn't 2008, right? And so they can still make the same spread. And the fact that you need a forbearance because of something well beyond your control doesn't mean now that, oh, yeah, and as part of the forbearance, we get to make more money and make your life more difficult.
And also they're getting backstopped, obviously. So now, the Fed's printing, as you guys know, trillions of dollars. So they're getting the liquidity. So Dorina, did we miss any of your questions or any follow-ups on that?
I think I'm good. I just, those are two main things: balloon and interest rates being potentially changed if the loan is being restructured. So I got the point that I would have to negotiate with the bank.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Just make sure you just understand that. Everyone just understand that just because that's their initial response, doesn't mean that's the final response. That's something you can negotiate. Thanks, Dorina. Anybody else have a pressing question before? Actually, that's what we're here for. So I want to make sure we get all your pressing questions. If not, I've got a question that I've seen online, but let me know if you've got something specific. Michael, you like the "don't be an asshole" comment. That's always, I thought that was great too. Yeah. All right. So the other thing that I've seen a lot popping up is just for those of us or those of you who are, in the middle of deals, right? You've got a contract, and we're seeing lenders either pausing, pulling out, like all these kind of things. You want to talk a little about what your thoughts are? Maybe you want to do it individually. Like, what if somebody, I think pausing is one thing, but what if somebody just wants to pull out, or what if they just want to renegotiate the loan now and say, hey, I want to high, like Dorina said, I want a higher interest rate. Talk a little bit about the people who are kind of in the middle of acquiring properties, and now the lender starts, playing games. What are your options there?
Again, you know, this is going to depend on where you're at in terms of, you know, if you're under contract versus property you own and you're in the midst of starting like a development and construction project, two different things, right? So if you're under contract, my first thing is, again, I'm looking to the force majeure clause, material adverse change, or financing contingencies to pick up the phone. And again, even if you have none of those things, you know, buyers are not lined up right now. So call your seller and tell them, listen, I still want to do the deal. My lender's playing games. I need, at this point, I would ask for a 60 to 90 day extension. And at first, sellers are probably going to balk at that. But the reality is, what we're seeing is that banks are, there are a lot of banks out there right now and a lot of lenders saying, hey, we're taking a 60 to 90 day pause because we don't know what's going on with the market. And so many of you will have leverage under your PSAs to put that hold in place. Many of you will not. But the reality is the seller is still in the same world that you're in. And so 60 to 90 days, who are they? What, they're going to start over with a new buyer and be in the same position. So the first thing is buy yourself the time under the PSA so that you don't have that pressure. And then the next thing you need to do is look at the numbers. The numbers will not lie. So at increased interest rates with flat rents and an increased vacancy, what does your pro forma look like? And I am a big fan of parallel tracks. So if I'm in that position, I'm first going to look at what number I need to be comfortable doing the deal. And I'm going to try to negotiate with my seller and see if I can get a reduction that still makes sense. Now, remember, that purchase price means a lower purchase price means your lender is going to also make a smaller loan. So you need to look at how much money you've raised or what buyer equity you can put in. A lot of times that means you may have to go back and raise a little bit more money to close the delta. That's the first thing. The next thing I'm doing is I'm shopping the deal around. I mean, if your lender, I'm looking for a new lender that's going to make a loan on more favorable terms. You may or may not find one in this environment, but it's definitely worth shopping it around. And I'm simultaneously negotiating with my existing lender to push back on that. And again, I'm going back to, why are you charging me more interest? You're making the same, if not more money on this deal. The other opportunity is, you know, at this point, there's also an opportunity to pursue alternative financing arrangements, right? Like depending on the situation, depending on your market, you may have a seller that is making a very significant upside, right? So it may be worth having a conversation with your seller because right now there aren't a lot of places to get yield. So, you know, maybe you negotiate mezz debt or an equity piece for your seller in your deal at an interest rate that makes sense, right? So you can maybe borrow less from the bank and make up that delta with secondary, you know, seller financing, maybe, and treat it as a bridge, 24 months. Those are just some ideas. But the other thing is that I would do is, you know, there's debt funds out there. I wouldn't suggest going to a hard money lender at this point. But there are definitely people out there that are creating debt funds. It may make sense to look at that market as well.
And Carrie, didn't you have a scenario also where you were negotiating with a seller to maybe put some, you know, 6 months worth of, you know, lease payments in escrow just to satisfy the lender as well? Because again, you're probably the best chance for the seller to sell the property, so right. The seller can chip in, right? Right. Exactly. You have a lot of options with a seller, and again, it's an ongoing negotiation, which is one of the reasons I say. When the banks, you know, if they're taking a pause 60 to 90 days, get it from the seller, because there's also a little bit of seller education that's going to go on here, right? Especially because where you have sellers that were just looking to cash out or retire, and, you know, they're not in the market looking for replacement properties. You know, you're going to need some sellers need a little time and need the opportunity for their broker to explain to them there aren't people lined up, right? I mean, a lot of you went under contract and there were 3 or 4 backup offers behind you. Now there aren't. But
you need to just give the seller a little time to catch up to your reality. So that's where that 60 to 90 days can be really helpful.
Hey, Carrie, real quick too, that just came to me as well. It's again, if you have a question, put it in the chat for me. But one of the things that popped up, and I think you and I were talking about it as well. Give me your thoughts on 1031s, right? So let's say you have the seller who's selling the property because they've got a 1031. Do you feel like, I mean, I haven't seen anything about any changes to that. I mean, it stands to reason that they may want to put an extension of that because of everything's going on. But how does all of this affect either a seller that's trying to sell, you're trying to buy a property where the seller's trying to 1031 out of it, or maybe you're trying to 1031 into a property. Talk a little bit about what you're seeing on the 1031 front.
Well, I mean, you're in it. You have, 180 days. So if you're trying to 1031 into a property, that is an issue. And if you have a seller that's identified properties, that's fine. Their clock starts ticking when they close, right? So while I have sellers that are saying, well, I intended to 1031, but I don't know, I may not be in a position to, I may not be in a position to like 1031 into such and such property, right? Because we might not close in time and that property might not be on the market anymore.
Right.
If you're a seller, I'm going to hold off, right, on identifying properties until I know we're ready to close. That's an easier situation. If you have money that you need to roll in, and your clock is ticking and your lender, gets put on pause, that's a problem. And I don't have a solution for that. I am actually been reaching out to the 1031 exchange companies I know to kind of see what they're seeing. I don't have a solution for that yet. That's probably a topic for next week.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I haven't seen anything. I hadn't even thought about it until whenever you and I talked about it. But I assume at some point that's going to come up, and they're going to have to. My guess is, and I have no basis of saying this, but I got to guess that they're going to do a little bit of extensions there because it's all a tax issue, right? So it's just IRS amending, kind of like a forbearance. You're going to get an extra 180 days, or you're going to have a year, or whatever needs to come. Anything else that's on your mind, Carrie? Because we're coming up on the top of the hour. And oh wait, Michael, let's get a thing here. You want to add? Well, let me just. Michael's asking, what's the single-family home space look like now? Does anyone know? He says, I want to do a cash-out refi on my primary home right now. Everyone that I've talked to says they're paused and they have raised the credit requirements. Do you have any pulse on that?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm currently, I'm in the midst of a purchase and sale, in Chicago right now. And, it's not being slowed down at all. And, they haven't had these issues. And in fact, that market right now, real estate and legal services are considered essential services. So they're open, even though the state of Illinois is on lockdown, and people are taking advantage of low rates. But that's just one jurisdiction. I think I am hearing that there's a number of lenders that are sitting tight. And I think that in the single family space, I think it also, I think my impression is that it's heading the same way that commercial is, which is raising credit requirements, and sitting on the sidelines. And I think that you're going to see that more at the lower price points, and the starter homes and first time buyers are going to have a more challenging time than at the higher price points.
Yep, and I see Devin, thanks for that. Devin's mentioned, he's on the call, that you started a refi yesterday, and so far, no known issues. So that's good news. Thanks, Devin. Anything that you want to add, Carrie, that we haven't talked about that you've seen in the last, since we were last on a week ago?
No, I mean, I guess what I would reiterate is all that's happening in my world that I'm seeing is that it's more important than ever to reach out to the tenants and reach out to your lenders. The communication right now is the big thing.
Yep.
The other thing is, Mauricio, yes, I'm sorry, there's a huge change. The stimulus bill was passed. So what we've heard at a high level is there's a lot of relief in there. There are options. We are going to be taking, we'll do a deep dive. I think there is a lot in there. I'm hearing from the accountants that it's also complicated. Right. Yeah. So, we need to roll up our sleeves and really look at that. And then we're going to need to have conversations with accountants because there's a lot of tax nuances involved with that, but it seems like there will be some opportunity there as well to leverage.
And Eugene, thanks for stepping into. You said that on a refi, just the only issue with the refis that you may encounter will be maybe some extended time frame to finish it as well. There's a lot of unknowns, obviously. Cool. Bethany, I wanted to wrap it up. And again, if you've got other questions, let me know. But one last thing I did want to bring in you, Bethany, and this is more on the syndication side, but you actually did a nice little cover letter. There's a lot of questions about what you should be doing with your investors, right? You're now in a deal. Your investors are, they're either freaking out or they're not getting distributions next month. We've been talking a lot about communication, kind of a theme going on here. Communication is key. Communicate with your tenants, communicate with your lender, but also communicate with your investors. So Bethany, you want to just let it kind of give your thoughts? Because I thought you did a great job on that sort of, we basically did a little bit of a ghost letter for one of our clients. But what are some of the things that the syndicators should be communicating with their investors?
I would say treat it just like you're treating it with the tenants. Keep open lines of communication. Do your regular reports, but maybe a little bit more frequently as things are changing. We've got a couple of clients right now that are they're calling me and asking me same thing that you're hearing on the other side of it, right? Is the lenders construction lending is paused and now we're on hold, but we've already bought the property, for example. If we go tell people this and they want their money back, you said at the beginning of the hour, do we have to give them their money back? And I was surprised to know that a lot of syndicators didn't know they don't have to do that. So explaining gently, the same that the way we're seeing with landlords and tenants, explain gently to the investors the state of the world right now. We're the manager. We have the right to make business decisions, but here's what we're doing. Everything we do, we're looking out for our investors' best interest. And you're right. We've been ghostwriting some of these correspondences for the syndicators just to make sure that they're not saying things that they ought not say, and that they're saying things that they should say. And the reality is, yes, you have an obligation as a syndicator to communicate with your investors. You don't have an obligation to solve your investors' financial woes as a result of this. And so it's important to know. It's important to know what's in your PPM. This is what I've been telling people is, look, everybody hates these things because they're so long and they're doomsday, but this is exactly why. This is exactly the scenario why we write them. So keeping in front of your investors, letting them know what you're doing as the manager of the syndication, and not driving more fear. I mean, again, it's changing weekly. Okay, so the lenders put a pause. They have on everybody. That's not necessarily the end of the world. Here's what we had said regarding your distributions, and maybe they're accruing, maybe they're not. Whatever the deal is, we'll dig into it and we'll help you communicate that.
Yeah, and and I did a post about this yesterday. Even if you don't have much to say, just communicate with your investors. Just keep those lines of communication open. They're not going to be shocked. I mean, I think priority one here is to conserve cash. I mean, people are already stopping distributions, and you don't want to be giving distributions and then having to do a cash call in 2 months. And so it's pretty expected worldwide, not worldwide, but syndication wide, that people are going to stop getting distributions. That might be an issue for the syndicator because they may have preferred terms in there, and those prefs are going to roll over. So eventually that's going to get paid out of their pocket. But, one of my dear friends is Ken McElroy, and he always said, and I did a post about this yesterday, which he says, communication builds trust. And especially in these times, some people have the inclination to stick their head in the sand and not communicate at all. And I think Kenny would tell you that the complete opposite is what you want to do. You want to over communicate at this point. Everybody's expecting, not the greatest news. It's not like you're the only one who suddenly, oh my God, the deal's going south, or I can't make a distribution. Everybody's in the same boat. The stock market's gotten shellacked for, 30%. It's gone back a little bit now, but so far they're not losing money. They're just not getting their distributions. And again, if they've got a pref, it'll just roll over. Again, just look at your PPM docs. But all right, it's been an hour. I want to be conscious of everyone's time. If you've got one last question in there, pop it in the chat, and we'll answer it. If not, I think the plan, we'll probably do another one on Wednesday. I think we're going to do Wednesdays and Saturdays, just so that you know, things are moving so fast that you know, by the time Wednesday rolls around, this is going to be outdated information probably. So we'll send out another. It's probably going to be the same link, but I'll make an announcement, and we'll get back together with a cup of coffee on Wednesday. And I might not have showered by then. I think I'll just go into my robe or something and do coffee with Carrie. So Carrie, thanks so much for your time. Bethany as well, and thanks everyone for taking time out on their Saturday morning to join us.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Have a good
everyone.
weekend.